At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Daryl Powell for the introductions.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Good morning to each of you. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. So we do appreciate you all being here today. I hope you all had a good day on yesterday. So we do want to send a special thank you to Alex and Clifton for all of the technical and behind the scene work, and thank our networking partners. I think James and Nancy, who were here on yesterday. And of course, we thank Linda and Brooke for all of the hard work behind the scene. Dr. O'Kelly for all that she's done. And we do want to thank our presenters, Ms. Cheryl, for being on with us today and sharing all of this good information. Last but not least, we want to thank all of our partners, participants who are heavily involved. I know now we're probably realizing it's a lot of work, and you're probably questioning, why did I get into this? But it is a good cause, and oftentimes I reflect on John Lewis and how he's emphasized the getting into good trouble, making necessary trouble, or just helping to redeem the soul of America. So I think we are on a good track to make those things happen. And we know that we've come a long ways in regards to the disability arena, and we've got a long ways to go. But I think we got a good group of people to help us get there. So I know that many of you probably, thinking of creative ways to make this world a better place for all of us. So we do appreciate, all that you all have done. So at some point, we probably pause and kind of reflect on what we've learned and, how did this weekend impact us? So we do want to at least start thinking in those terms. So we do appreciate everyone up to this point. And I think right now we're going to turn it over to our first presenter, Ms. Cheryl. So we appreciate you, and we're glad that you're sharing all of this great information with us.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And happy Saturday morning to you all. I want to start by saying that I felt a little off balance yesterday, and it was noticeable by my husband, who was sitting in the other room listening. And he mentioned to me later, he said, your voice sounded really shaky yesterday. So I think it's just been a really busy week, and I think I'm in better shape this morning. Plus, today, I'm really talking a whole lot more about my passion, which is the full employment of people with disabilities. I also want to start off by saying that I spent the morning watching, I forget the name, Vertical Harvest. And I don't know if I should admit this or not, but very few things impress me anymore. And I was really impressed by watching that yesterday, or watching that this morning. I had not seen it before. I had not heard of it before. Jackson, Wyoming is one of my, or used to be when I lived in Washington State, one of my favorite go-to places for summer. And I have now added it back to the top of my bucket list in terms of next time I get out to the Pacific Northwest, I want to go and visit them. And what really kind of impressed me is this is not an employment program. They are not an employment program in that this is a business, this is a process. This was like a holistic approach to everything that they did. And I think that's what kind of really impressed me. It was a very deliberate effort at employing people with disabilities, but it wasn't a program. We weren't putting people in little boxes and expecting them to say, gee, thank you very much for the job kind of thing. So whoever found that, I want to thank you, because I am going to pay a visit to them, and I'm going to talk more about how they did that. So I was excited about that. And I thought your questions yesterday were really good. And I would have asked more questions had I had the background. So anyway, can you pull up the first PowerPoint for me? And as I gather my thoughts, the first thing that thank you, that you will be receiving, if you have not received it yet, is a PDF document of a report called Segregated and Exploited: The Failure of the DD System to Provide Meaningful Work. And that was a report that was issued in 2011. And most of the times reports will get, they have a shelf life and they will get pretty old pretty quickly. But the reason that I think it's kind of important that you look at this report and you read it is because I think I mentioned yesterday that I have been working at the National Disability Rights Network for 27 years. So that takes me back to like 1996 when I started. And back in 1996, when I went to work for NDRN, the P&As kept talking about community integration. And what they were really talking about was closing large institutions, both mental health facilities and DD facilities, and moving people into the community. And that's a very, grand and noble and important action. But I kept asking staff at staff meetings, why are we talking about community integration and not talking about employment of people with disabilities? Because I think deinstitutionalization has a whole lot more to do with not just where you sleep at night, but it's how you engage in the community and with things while, it's just as much about engagement in the community as it is about where you sleep at night. And the example that I always use for that, I mentioned, or I can't remember, I was on 4 meetings yesterday. I live in Pennsylvania. When I go to my office, which I did faithfully every day for 24 years before COVID hit, my commute was 108 miles each way, which meant that I spent anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours getting to the office in the morning, and then the same amount of time coming home at night. I spent 7 to 8 hours a day with my coworkers at work, and yet I slept in Pennsylvania. And my point really has to do with the fact that I'm married, my husband is here, but I would basically see him for about an hour and a half every day. And because he was an early riser, goes to bed early and rises early in the morning. So the bulk of my time was not spent in the house that I live in. It was spent either on the train with people I knew or people I was riding with, or it was spent with my colleagues at work. And that's basically what constitutes my life, so to speak. So when I would be asking about why aren't we talking about employment, part of it was that we didn't have a program that was funded specifically to talk about employment, but also we were still very concerned and focusing on abuse and neglect within institutions. So it was not until 2009 when Henry's Turkey Farm happened. And I'm wondering, kind of by, people can nod their head or something, if how many people are aware when I talk about Henry's Turkey Farm about what Henry's Turkey Farm really is. So how many people of you know what Henry's Turkey Farm is? I'm seeing, okay, of the faces that I'm seeing, people are shaking their head no. And so I'm going to tell you, because this was really the tipping point for when talking about employment of people with disabilities, especially those in segregated settings, was finally an okay issue to talk about in public. Before that, we had to talk in really global terms about the employment rate of people with disabilities and the workforce participation of people with disabilities, but we couldn't really talk about those that were segregated in congregate day facilities or programs that were paying sub-minimum wage work, because it was like an off subject. So let me tell you about Henry's. Henry's Turkey Farm was a very novel idea that started around it was in the early 70s. And what happened was Henry, whatever his last name is, I can't remember, some of the details are, kind of moved on. But anyway, he took 30 men out of a DD facility in Texas and relocated them to this small town, Atalissa, Iowa. And in Atalissa, Iowa, there was there was the Louis Rich turkey processing plant. Now, I'm sure you've all bought Louis Rich turkey products at some point, but these men were moved from Texas, taken out of the institution, moved to Adolissa, Iowa, and they basically were living in an abandoned schoolhouse, or a school that was no longer being used, and it was converted into what is called the bunkhouse for the men to live in, with a caretaking couple who was basically overseeing the daily kind of living part of their life, basically supervising them in the residential facility. Fast forward to 2009, and the caretakers were tired of doing what they were doing. They were ready to retire. So they had contacted family members to say, what would you like to have happen to these men now that we're retiring? So that was kind of how the whole thing started. Well, what happened over the number of years was that these men were not employed by the Louis Rich turkey processing plant. They were employed by Henry's Turkey Farm, as it was known. So Henry subcontracted the services of these men to the Louis Rich turkey processing plant. So there was like an agreement where Louis Rich paid Henry, and it was Henry's responsibility to pay the men. Okay. These men were working 65 hours a week, doing some pretty, working alongside non-disabled peers, doing some heavy duty, work, like, pulling, well, I'm just doing what needs to be done to take a turkey from a live turkey to whatever form it needs to go to market. So these men were working 65 hours a week, and Henry was paying them a whopping $65 a month. Okay. In addition to the fact that they were being heavily exploited, there's no other word for it, because the men had been moved from Texas out of an institution, they were SSI eligible. They were eligible for supplemental security income, which comes with Medicaid rather. Medicaid does not cross state lines, and nobody had notified the Social Security Administration or the Medicaid agency that these men were now living in Adolissa, Iowa. So they were denied access to health care. And furthermore, because they were no longer in the institution, they were SSI eligible. And guess who the representative payee was for the men's Social Security benefits? So for each of these men, Henry was getting their supplemental security income each month. Henry was getting their wages from the Louis Rich turkey processing plant. And guess who was getting rich? On the backs of people with disabilities. So it was a pretty horrific situation that had gotten worse over the years. And so that's really the crux of the story that you need to know. There was a lot of exploitation, a lot of abuse. And when it was discovered, one of the sisters went to visit her brother, who she had not, seen in many, many years, because he had, basically been put in the institution as a child. But when she got the letter about, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to send these men back to Texas, back into their old neighborhood? Or the alternative that was offered was, we can put them into a nursing home in Iowa. Now, aside from the fact that how do you work 65 hours a week one week and qualify for nursing home skilled care the next week is, again, another matter of a lot of violations of law. And the reason that they were able to do that is because Henry had a brother who ran a nursing home. So anyway, when all of this happened, it became really fodder for us to talk about what really happens behind closed doors and what really happens in segregated settings. So that's what started the first public discussion about subminimum wage. And the day that we issued that report, I had a phone call from a friend of mine who works in Colorado, which is actually one of the more progressive states, I knew the phone number, but when I answered the phone, there was just like this sobbing on the other end of the phone. And I waited until Bob was able to talk, and he said, "Thank you for issuing this report, because now I think there's going to be hope for my son." So that was really kind of the turning point about really talking about people with disabilities, and not just talking about employment in general, but talking about those individuals with the most significant disabilities who have been forced into either rehabilitation programs or sheltered workshops. Really talking about, when we talk about employment, we're talking about employment for all. Just like when we talk about the ADA and we talk about, the ADA covers all people with disabilities. That was the expectation of the ADA. When we talk about IDEA and the education of children with disabilities, we're talking about education for all children. Yet, for as long as I've been doing this work, when we talk about employment of people with disabilities, the question always becomes, is it all can work, or is it all who can work? And so this is kind of my soapbox. And I can talk about employment in this regard for days and days. So any questions before I start? And let me open up the chat box again. I'm going to try to read the chat box too. If I miss a question, just like yesterday, if you have a question, raise your hand, which will bring you up to the top of my screen and I can see it. And if I don't catch it, if somebody else, wants to remind me of it, or I don't have a problem if you unmute yourself and say you have a question. And as I'm looking through the chat box right now, I see a question or a statement by that says, "Isn't VR's obligation to address the employment of those most impacted by disability?" And absolutely, positively, it is. And I have to tell you that really my first, when I first started in advocacy, rather as a service provider, when I first started working in disability, it was with the Client Assistance Program, and I read the Rehabilitation Act. And the Rehabilitation Act has been very clear since 1973, which is really what we consider the Rehabilitation Act has been around now for about 90 years, but it was not until 1973 that the Rehabilitation Act really opened up vocational rehabilitation to all people with disabilities. Because like so many of the programs during the New Deal era of the Roosevelt administration, the original Rehabilitation Act was really intended to help returning veterans from war. It was the end of World War I. And so services were being provided to help people primarily with physical disabilities to return to work. And by 1973, the Rehab Act was opened up to all people with disabilities, because the belief was everybody was entitled to those services and supports. And so it's very clear in the Rehab Act of 1973 that vocational rehabilitation is supposed to provide services to those individuals with the most significant disabilities first. But I've always kind of considered the Rehabilitation Act kind of like the fruit tree, where they're going to take the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones that are easy to serve, and then they can pat themselves on the back and say, "Oh, look, what a great job I did rehabilitating somebody who really probably only just needed a job, or needed a piece of equipment, or needed something very simple. They were higher functioning individuals. They needed just a little bit of help and go back to work." And I use myself as a classic example, because you can't see me, you can't see the bottom part of me, but I have orthopedic impairments, clearly from my motorcycle accident. As I get older and I get heavier, the issues get a little more complicated. But if I were to apply for vocational rehabilitation services, I bet they would not only find me eligible for services, but if They were only serving what they considered people with most significant disabilities. They would find me most significantly disabled. I could ask them for an electric mobility device. I would probably ask them for some type of ramp or attachment to the back of my car so that I could carry the mobility device. And the justification would be that I attend a lot of meetings and I would need that to get around because I'm not able to walk in transportation, blah, blah, blah. And then once they bought those for me, they pat themselves on the back and say, oh, look, we rehabilitated her. So I'm not a big fan of vocational rehabilitation, mostly because I know everything they don't do properly versus what they do properly. And I know they do a lot of good, but we only hear about the things they don't do. I see another question in here is, did Henry go to jail? Henry was convicted. The EEOC actually took up the case of Henry's Turkey Farm, and they prosecuted using the same principles of human trafficking. And the jury awarded the largest damages that had ever been awarded by the EEOC in that case. That's the good news. The bad news is the damages are limited under the ADA. And so the men really didn't get the millions and millions of dollars that were awarded to them. But nonetheless, it set a lot of policy changes in motion. Henry was convicted. I don't honestly remember if he went to jail or not. He was also fined millions of dollars, but he died before the money was repaid. So anyway, and we found that set in motion a number of things. Social Security Administration was extremely embarrassed when they realized that benefits had been paid to this representative payee rather than to the men, and the damage that had resulted in the financial exploitation. So that started one of the new P&A programs. Because of Henry's Turkey Farm, Social Security came to us and we started monitoring representative payees to make sure, especially representative payees that were also employers of these men, to make sure that this financial exploitation was not going on in other parts of the country. So good things have happened as a result of it, but these men should never have been subject to that. And one final note about Henry is that, there is a book that was published by a New York Times reporter. Don't know why I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, called The Boys in the Bunkhouse, that if you're ever really kind of interested in reading more and doing some follow-up on what happened to these men after they left the bunkhouse, that book is available. I had it sitting on here table a week or two ago, but I think I put it away. Dan, and I can't remember Dan's last name. So anyway, that's where kind of Henry's came from. And so I was really, really excited because once Henry's Turkey Farm hit the news and we started training the P&As and having them go in and do sheltered workshop monitoring and all kinds of things, we have made a great deal. We have made progress since there, but we still have a long way to go. So next slide, please. So I've titled this The Vision for People Work Like Us. So I always start when I talk about presentations, we don't necessarily do things because it's the right thing to do, although I think we should. We have public policy and laws that guide the principles of our country. And according to both the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the ADA, which has almost identical language, the purpose of these laws and the purpose of the ADA is to assure equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities. And that's in what we call the preamble to the legislation. And so how can we talk about full participation, equality of opportunity, and economic self-sufficiency if we're not talking about employment? Okay. Meaningful employment is really important to not only establishing dignity, but to allow people the same opportunities to in the community. When you have money, you can buy things. When you have money, you can decide how you're going to spend your money, what you're going to eat, where you're going to go, even down to, very simple choices that you and I probably take for granted. People with disabilities are often denied those choices because they don't have the money. So we look at the Rehabilitation Act, and the Rehabilitation Act, which again, as far as I'm concerned, was the predecessor to the ADA and contained the original. Everybody's heard of Section 504, right? Okay, we know that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says government services can't discriminate against people with disabilities. But that's also where all the rights sections are. But the Rehabilitation Act itself empowers individuals to maximize employment economic self-sufficiency. And again, that's the emphasis. So when you look at the emphasis is to maximize employment and economic self-sufficiency, and the fact that that it's supposed to make those services available to individuals with the most significant disabilities. I think the Rehab Act is so far the VR agencies are failing to meet not only the letter of the law, but the intent of the law. So and that's not to say that VRs are evil people, but I think they really do need to be held accountable. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I want people to unmute themselves for a minute and tell me, why do people work?
To put their dreams into motion.
Okay, what kind of dreams, Niles?
Whatever it is, economic freedom, starting their own business, donating to a specific charity that they want to donate to. It could. That's why I said dreams, because it covers pretty much anything that you can think of.
Anything you can think of. Okay, that's great. Somebody else?
Purpose and self-fulfillment.
Okay. That's
Angela,
good.
this is Angela. Yes, some people work simply to add purpose and meaning to their lives.
Okay. Meaning, purpose, good. Jess?
Some people work because you got to pay the bills. The world runs on money. It's the reality. We know it. The world runs on money. The hope is you find what you do, you enjoy what you do, but sometimes you just have to pay the bills.
Absolutely. Anybody else? I can't see. I don't know why I can't get this to move. Anybody else want to add to that? So we're talking about fulfilling dreams and paying the bills. And Angie, I forget what you said. I'm sorry. Say it again.
That's okay. Purpose and meaning. Just having
Purpose
a meaningful purpose
okay.
in their life.
Anybody else?
We have in the chat to create change from Brooke.
Okay, good. Thank you. I just, I can't do too many things at the same time. Okay. So you guys get the idea. I mean, work is a purpose. I want to go back to my question that I asked yesterday. And that's, how many of you were ever told that, when you grow up and you graduate from high school, it's okay, you can stay here, mom and dad are going to take care of you for the rest of your life? Okay. So yeah, I mean, there's basic things that are expected, and quite frankly, I think that I don't want to use the word normal because I don't want to offend anybody, but I think, parental expectations are, we're going to feed you, we're going to clothe you, we're going to educate you, and then you are going to take over and you're going to fly and you're going to take care of yourself. The expectation is not that we're going to take care of you for the rest of our lives. So work has a very defined and important role in our life, correct? Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, please. All right, so we know that working is fundamental to adulthood, quality of life issues, and earnings gives us the choice to make, or the opportunity to make choices. And I am typically not a big Woody Allen fan. However, I do like this quote of his. And he says, money is better than poverty if only for financial reasons. Now, why do I talk about poverty when I'm talking about employment of people with disabilities? And there's a very strong connection there. People with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty as a person without disability. And the older you get, the greater the likelihood of increasing the older you get, the deeper into poverty you get. And there's lots of studies available, and there's data about this. And if anybody wants it, don't think I included it in here. Why are people more likely to be in poverty as they get older? Because people, as they work, the longer they work, the more money they earn. And if you're not able to work as you get older, then it has the reverse effect in terms of putting people deeper into poverty. And people with disabilities, the only route out of poverty that I know is work. Okay. Even if you win the lottery, study after study shows that people who win the lottery oftentimes are bankrupt within 3 years of winning the lottery. So work is your only route out of poverty, and it's going to determine your standard of living, basically. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I heard mentioned yesterday about labor force participation. And so I am going to talk about it a little bit, because it's not only people with disabilities, but also we have to look at the intersectionality of people with disabilities and the ethnic group to which you belong. So in December of 2022, we had actually the highest workforce participation rate that we have seen in years. And that was, we had 39% of people with disabilities were employed in December of 2022. But there's, and so the workforce participation rate of people without disabilities was at basically 77%. And this is based on information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has only been reporting disability data for about the last 10 or 12 years. I can't remember exactly when it started, but I know that advocates spent a couple of years hounding the Department of Labor Statistics, which is, a government agency within DC, to start counting people with disabilities, because we really had no idea what was happening with individuals with disabilities. And prior to that time, if I was to ask a group, what is the unemployment rate of people with disabilities, they would typically tell me that the unemployment rate was 75 or 80%. And that was incorrect, because in order to be unemployed, you have to first be employed. So if we're not reporting those data and statistics, then we don't really know what we're talking about. Okay, so of the individuals who were working, 29% of people with disabilities who are working part-time versus 16% for those without a disability. So I ponder, and this concerns me, because I think there is a very deliberate reason why people with disabilities are working part-time. And that is because of the belief that if they work more, they will lose their benefits. And they're scared to death to lose their benefits for a whole bunch of reasons. Oftentimes, it has more to do with the loss of the medical insurance that they need, because people with disabilities will have higher utilization of medical services, and medical services will help stabilize their condition. So you don't want to be without health care. Nobody wants to be without health care. And so people work part-time in order to reduce their earnings in order to protect their benefits. And that's really why my spiel yesterday was about the fact that people need to understand that they can work more and they can earn more and they can still have those critical protections in place, but they're going to be better off financially by working than not working. And so The part-time employment does continue to concern me. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities was 5.4% last year versus, again, higher than the unemployment rate for people without a disability, which was only at 3.2%. Next slide, please. But what was interesting over the last couple of years was that even during COVID, people with disabilities did not necessarily lose jobs at the high percentage that people without disabilities did. So we're kind of in a recovery period now. Now, let's look at the disparate impact of unemployment. If you are African American, the unemployment rate last year for people with disabilities was 8.5%. That's clearly higher than people who than the general average for people with disabilities. It's like 3% higher. If you're Hispanic, it was 6.6%. Asians were 5%, and Caucasians was less than 4%. So again, we see that ethnic minorities are affected differently by the unemployment, and all categories except African Americans or Black declined over the previous years. So again, we need to be looking at why are these disparities within the population? I don't have the answers. I'm just giving the information. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, we also know that people with disabilities are more likely to experience other kinds of hardships, such as food insecurity, which means they have a higher utilization of SNAP or food stamps, the inability to pay rent, mortgages, or utilities, and the inability to get access to medical care. And again, part of that is transportation issues. There's a number of things, but these are all well documented. So again, we come back to the point that a full and integrated life requires a meaningful, integrated way to spend your day, including real jobs that pay real wages. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. So people with disabilities have told us they want to work. Okay. I didn't make this up. We have lots, again, of studies that have been documented, as well as live events. Can't remember, again, exactly how long ago it was. It was probably at least 15 years ago. There was this movement that we called Alliance for Full Participation, which was a collaborative effort among a number of national disability organizations to kind of really look at and address why what was really happening with why were people with disabilities not being included to the extent that it was originally intended? And really it started out looking at the ADA. Why, following the ADA, do we still find people segregated and left at home? So they held this huge conference in Washington, D.C. And the conference brought together 2,500 self-advocates, individuals self-identifying as people with disabilities. And we did some training sessions with them, but we also had a lot of what we call town halls to talk about what were the issues of importance to them. And this was prior to America's Got Talent or whatever the show was back there when you had the electronic voting things. I mean, those were just starting to come in. So we had 2,500 people in an audience, and we asked them, what are the issues that you as people with disabilities want us, and us being the policy folks or the advocates on a national level that were, meeting with the feds and, meeting with Hill staff to propose legislation. What is it that you want us to really focus on? And it was kind of interesting because the people who did housing said, well, clearly the number one issue is going to be affordable and accessible housing. And the people who did medical work on medical issues said it's going to be that we want improved medical services and accessible, medical equipment, and we want, affordable health insurance, universal access. And, other people, everybody who had their little targeted area of whatever said, this is what's going to be most important. And what the advocates actually told us was our first priority is we want you to help us get policies and procedures in place to increase our employment opportunities. Because if you get us jobs, we will have money and we will be able to decide where we want to live. And we won't necessarily have to rely on public low-income housing. And if we get jobs, we will probably get health insurance to the extent that everybody else does. So we don't need you to expand public health care services. And if you get us jobs, we will figure out our transportation. We will be able to buy cars, or we will be able to pay for taxi cabs, or we will be able to, utilize public transportation services. So the number one issue that they said they wanted changed was access to employment opportunities. And then there was another study that was done about the same time. And again, yesterday I mentioned the Ticket to Work program. There are roughly 7.5 million individuals who are eligible for that ticket from Social Security. And what that really means is that they are between the ages of 14 and 65, and they have an opportunity to participate and receive employment supports. And Mathematica, which is a, big think tank in Washington, D.C., did an evaluation for the Social Security Administration, and they surveyed all the individuals who were on Social Security between the ages of 14 and 65. And they asked, one of the questions that they asked is, would you consider going to work? And what would it take for you, to consider? So 80% of the people who are ticket eligible have indicated that if they had the ideal situations and the perfect supports and services, they would go back to work. And so again, that's a huge number. So we know that people want to work. We also know that everyone has skills and talents that can be matched to a real job. And what I kind of really liked in the vertical harvest was the fact that they mentioned what everybody's skill or interests were. What is it they do in their spare time that they really like? So, going skiing, doing artwork, doing all of these other things showed that, people have skills and talents and things that they're interested in. We also know that there's thousands of occupations in the U.S. economy that people with disabilities can do. And when you look beyond the ableism, you will see people with disabilities working every single day. And nothing annoys me more than how many of you are on social media, one form or the other, okay? I'm sure a lot of you are on social media, and somebody posts a video of an individual with autism singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the opening of a basketball game or a football game, and everybody goes, oh, look how special that is. And that's not special, that's just people. Okay, people have skills and talents. So we need to, stop thinking that that's so remarkable. We know that people can work. And we also know that people with very significant disabilities have demonstrated their ability to work if provided a good job match and appropriate supports. Okay, so next slide. And I know I'm probably telling you guys nothing that you don't know. So here's a question for you. We know how to do it. So why aren't more people with disabilities working? So again, I'd like to hear from some of you as to why you think people with disabilities aren't working.
I have a question first.
Okay, Jess first, then Niles. Jess?
So this is Jess. I have a question first.
Okay, you're loud.
I think that looking back, remind me, is there actually, so here's how I know this. I used to be a physical therapist, and I had a patient who was in a serious motor vehicle accident and was applying for disability benefits and all that. But she was also trying to go back to work, but She was afraid of losing her benefits, but is there like a maximal threshold to where if you make over this X amount of money, you no longer have any Social Security benefits or disability short-term benefits? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about, and the answer is yes, and the answer is no. Okay. If you are talking about an individual who has applied for Social Security disability benefits from the Social Security Administration, and they have gotten through the process, and the process can be pretty arduous, although you mentioned a person who was in an accident. I had my accident when I was 27 years old. My accident happened on Friday, August 13th, a day which for me I will never forget. But I applied for benefits my second week that I was in the hospital, and I had my notice of award within 6 weeks because I met something that was called the medical listing. Okay. Most people don't meet the medical listing. Less than 20% of Social Security applicants meet the medical listing, and the medical listings, have some very definite medical criteria. So the average person, it can take a couple of years to receive the benefit. And so you've got the Social Security disability insurance based on your prior work history. There is something when you go back to work after you complete the 9-month trial work period that I talked about, where you can earn any amount of money. You could earn, if you were selling real estate, you could ideally, if you sold 3 houses during that period of time, you could have earned, $30,000 in that 9-month period of time. And it wouldn't count. But SGA, or substantial gainful activity, it's difficult to explain because it's nuanced. It's basically if you were to earn just slightly more than $2,000 in 2023, you are considered to be substantially gainfully employed. And the $2,000 would then potentially kick you off of benefits because you are working at a substantial level. But again, there's work incentives that can be applied. There's things that can be applied. So I would be committing malpractice if I told you don't go to work and don't earn more than $2,000. Yes, potentially an individual who was on SSDI would lose their benefit. But for SSI, it's just the opposite. With the 2-for-1 offset for somebody who has little work experience, they could lose their benefit, their entitlement to the cash benefit, but still have access to the health care. So it's hard for me to give you a specific answer, but the answer is yes, but not really. So is that about as clear as mud?
It is, and it pretty much what you said towards the end, especially that like 2000. And again, the points you brought up, a lot of people are afraid, but there's so many. I think there's just so much confusion with how it really truly works and everything. But that's basically what she was told. She was basically told in the malpractice manner of, oh, you can't work because if you go over this, you lose everything.
Right. And that's why it's really important that those individuals seek out WIPA services to understand, because they can explain it in greater detail. But yes.
So this scenario is why I believe firmly why more people with disabilities don't want to work or choose not to work, because that fear is there and that situation unfortunately does happen.
That's absolutely true. I agree with that. Okay. Niles, what were you going to say?
So I was going to I'm glad Jess brought that up, because to build off of that, there is a lot of confusion. There is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of loopholes, rules. At will employment especially is basically like an official loophole built into the law code here, where they're not quite sure if they'll even if they get employment, will they be able to keep it? Will they be able to advocate for their rights? Will they be able to, if they do advocate for their rights, what's going to happen if they do? There's a lot of uncertainty and fear behind it. And that's why there's a lot of people in general not working, but especially people with disabilities.
Okay. Okay, good point. Anybody else?
Yeah, Angie here. I think there are a couple of reasons or factors why people with disabilities are not able to get employed or stay employed. And one of them would be, the inherent bias that they would have to face. Some people are inherently biased, and no matter what you do or say, they're not going to change their viewpoint of a person that has a disability. And then the second issue is poor work choices, not having meaningful work that makes them feel proud about being able to contribute in a meaningful way.
Good point. Anybody else? Oh, Jennifer.
I am speaking from experience related to persons in my daughter's age range, which is late 20s, 30s. It takes a lot of effort on behalf of the family to assist that person with a disability. If the person who is transitioning after high school has a job coach and community exploration, it seems a lot easier for them to find a job. And now keeping a job, of course, is up to that person and their support team. But the longer a person with a disability goes without an employment, the harder it is for them to, think about going back to work or to start work. And as their parents age, some of them, just are too tired to make the effort, and they need advocates for them. I have been trying to encourage one of our friends to get back in the workplace, and her mom was like, I just can't do it. I'm too tired. We don't have any transportation. The parent has a disability as well. And it's like, it's much easier for that person to stay home all day and take care of their dog than to be out in the workforce and have more meaningful experiences in the work. So it really takes a village sometimes to help that person. And some people are just, it's just too much for them psychologically to do.
So it sounds to me, and you don't have to respond to this, like you're suggesting that the responsibility that, well, I think what I'm hearing, it's not what you're saying. What I'm hearing, or what I'm interpreting that to mean, is that the services and supports that the individual needs are not being met by the community, and it's relying heavily on the parents who are tired.
Yes, I see that a lot, especially,
Right.
like I said, in the persons in late 20s, 30s,
Right.
the
And-
circle of friends of
And
my
they've gone through IDEA and they've received that education services.
Right.
So the question, or what that basically says to me, is that IDEA has some very specific transition requirements that have been there since 1990 that mirror the language in the Rehabilitation Act for transition services. And yet there has not been a transition. The transition is you're done with school. And unless they were willing and or able to go directly to the sheltered workshop, which has been the option that they have been offered with, they've not been receiving the proper services that they need to transition to adult life.
Right. That is true for some persons, yes.
Right.
And other people, if the person with a disability is a real self-advocate for themselves and they want that, and the family is encouraging, then I have seen it goes full steam, because that's the type of family that we are. But for others, it's just, they're just burned out and don't know where to begin, or you have to start all over again once that person loses their job. And that has happened to several people.
Right. Good points. Anybody else? Not seeing any. I think. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Christy Giles. So for me, we live in a very rural county that does not offer a lot of supports for our people with disabilities. Even our children who are in the school system are not supports they need. I have a 16-year-old daughter with Down syndrome, and we've fought like tooth and nail to get what we're getting, and it's still not what she should be getting.
Right. So all of these are really good points, and it's complicated, but I think I want to address a couple of things. I mean, bias and stigma is alive and well. Discrimination is alive and well. As much as I would like to say that 23 or 33 years post ADA, discrimination is still alive and well. And as my boss used to say, discrimination is our business and business is good. Poor work choices or poor jobs. That cannot be understated. The fact that oftentimes we pigeonhole people into jobs that we think they can do based on our own implicit bias or the implicit bias of the employer that, you know, well, people with disabilities can't do things, so we need to keep this simple. We need to, you know, this is the work I need. This is the job that I have. This is what needs to be done. So let's hire some person with the disability who's going to feel thankful that they have the opportunity to work, whether they like the job, whether they're well suited to the job, you know, whatever. So you definitely, you know, have kind of hit that nail on the head. We have a lot of work to do in terms of educating the public to reduce the stigma, and also with employers to reduce the stigma, because people are afraid of what they don't really know. If they don't know a person with a disability, their attitudes about people with disabilities are going to be limited. And this kind of implies what they can't do. So when I'm working with folks, I always talk about the fact that we need to assume employability. And our job for people with disabilities, just like for people without disabilities, is to identify what their strengths and abilities are and to build on those rather than to just pigeonhole somebody and say, this is what they need to do. So you guys know what the problems are. There's no doubt. Our job and your job as advocates are going to be to help overcome the stigma, to help educate people, to help educate the public so that we can address some of these issues. So you guys know what the problems are. Let's continue. There's a couple of messages in. Okay, I see Nancy's put some information in the chat box about how to some of the finding help through the ticket program, the Choose Work SSA.website. And also, I cannot underestimate the purpose of vocational rehabilitation is to help individuals, even those with the most significant disabilities, prepare for, obtain, maintain, and regain employment consistent with their strengths, interests, priorities, and capabilities. And so who helps hold VR's feet to the fire is the Client Assistance Program. So if people are having difficulty accessing vocational rehabilitation services, then you go to the Client Assistance Program, which is now within ADAP in Alabama, and they should be able to assist you, whether it's accessing the services. They get $3.2 billion a year across the nation to provide services only to people with disabilities. And yet, last year, almost $1 billion of VR money was returned unspent because different states say they didn't have the clients or the ability to provide services. And that's a separate conversation. We can talk about this a little more at the end when we have time for discussion. Okay, so VR, as far as I'm concerned, is the first go-to for people with disabilities because they get funding just to do that. And then there are also the public services that I mentioned yesterday, the American Job Centers, apprenticeship programs, other Department of Labor programs, Job Corps, other publicly funded services cannot discriminate against people with disabilities. So there should be services and supports out there available. We'll talk more about that later. All right, next slide, please. Good comments. Thank you all. All right, so I can tell you after years and years and years of doing this work, and I did job placement for 4 years, actually, 4 years almost to the day. The biggest barrier to employment of people with disabilities is lack of expectation. Okay. And I say that because I have experienced that. We should be asking, we need to have a paradigm shift. Special education, there's nothing special about special education. I hate that term. Education is education, and the whole thinking and the purpose is that we educate to the needs of the child, and not everybody learns the same way. Okay, so education should be starting with kids in kindergarten, asking kids with disabilities, what do you want to be when you grow up? You don't wait until somebody is 17 years old and then say, oh, by the way, have you ever thought about going to work? Or maybe you might want to think about going to work, or gee, you're at working age now. We need to start setting that expectation for people with disabilities when they are very, very young. Because when we don't set the bar very high, we are not disappointed then. Okay, we need to raise the expectations. And I could tell you some stories about some individuals with very, very significant disabilities who I have found I was able to help find employment for. But I look back at stories I've heard from some of the national or people with disabilities who are working on a national level. And particularly, Kathy Martinez used to be the Assistant Secretary of Labor at the Department of Labor. And Kathy Martinez is blind. And Kathy Martinez has been blind from birth. Okay. So she went to vocational rehabilitation when she was in high school. And vocational rehabilitation gave her, or did an evaluation for her, and their suggestion for her in terms of employment was that she go to work at the local lock factory putting locks together. Okay. And Kathy Martinez kind of said, I don't think that's what I want to do. And VR didn't think she was capable of doing anything else other than assembly work. And, here she's the Assistant Secretary of Labor on a national program. But I've talked to Kathleen many times, and she tells a story about the fact that when she was a child, she was expected to help and do chores around the house, just like her brothers and her sisters were. And the chore that kind of shocked me the most was she was telling about how she used to cut the grass. Now, I had 3 brothers, so my brothers had the chore of cutting the grass. But I remember the time that I decided I was going to cut the grass, and my father was petrified that I was going to cut my toes off with the lawnmower. I mean, I basically couldn't go out and cut the grass unless I had steel-toed shoes on. And when you're 13 or 14 years old, I don't think I knew what steel-toed shoes were. But anyway, so Kathy's telling this story, and I'm sitting there thinking, and then finally I said, Kathy, if you are blind and you are cutting the grass, how do you know where you have cut? I mean, I was like looking at it very realistically. And she said, oh, that's easy. Cut the grass barefoot. Okay. So in that, I realized that there was expectations that her parents had on her, which was really good. So she was always like motivated to do things, but also the fact that she was provided what I'm going to call the dignity of risk. She was allowed to do things, to be able to try to do things, whereas my father would never have given me the authority to cut the grass in bare feet. I mean, he would have tied me to a chair before he would have let me do that. So again, it all comes down to what are the expectations that we set for people with disabilities. And there is no way in 2023 that we should be allowing kids to go through the school system and then retire on SSI benefits once they leave school. So lack of expectation, and I've heard it time and time again from other people. Next slide, please. Okay, so we look at public policy because that's what I do. I'm going to turn my camera off for 30 seconds to grab something. Policy says disability is a natural part of the human experience, okay? And it does not diminish our right to live independently, enjoy self-determination, make choices, contribute to society, and pursue meaningful careers. We have got to stop those 3 Fs or 4 Fs, People with disabilities can do more than food, filth, piling, and flowers. Okay, but we've never given them the opportunity to express what it is they want to do, and so we need to start doing that way earlier. Next slide, please. Okay. So the premise and the policy that we build on, which, and I do believe that people with disabilities have civil rights, and that's to participate. We all know about IDEA, that people get free and public appropriation or public education. We talk about deinstitutionalization and that people should be allowed to live in the community with the supports that they need. We talk about the ADA, that is the promise of non-discrimination for all individuals with disabilities. And the ADA is very, very, broad coverage, because it not only talks about people with disabilities who have the protections, but also people who are regarded as having a disability, as well as people who associate with people with disabilities. But again, and I made this point earlier, when we start talking about employment, I hear all this discussion about not everybody can work, not everybody should work, okay? And as far as I'm concerned, employment is an opportunity for everybody. Next slide. All right, so looking at the history of sheltered workshops, they didn't start out as a bad idea. In the 50s and the 60s, parents of children with disabilities for the first time were keeping their children at home. It was no longer believed or necessary that if you had a child with a disability, you didn't give up custody and put them in an institution, presuming that they would be well cared for in the institution. And we all know, of course, that institutions were not the charming, lovely, summer homes that we had hoped they were going to be. Geraldo Rivera did the expose on the Willowbrook Training School in Staten Island, New York, that exposed the horrible conditions in institutions. So during the 70s, we started to see legal actions around the country to close these. Next slide. We stopped that. So there was a huge movement about moving people out of these institutions and keeping children home. Made perfect sense. So what parents did then, because parents still had jobs, parents had responsibilities and still needed to go to work. So the congregate facilities kind of started because parents still needed to go to work. And if there were 4 kids in the neighborhood, instead of having 4 parents quit their jobs to stay home, let's put these children together. Let them socialize with each other. Let them kind of learn. This was before children were allowed in school. And then as these kids got older, the expectation was, well, let's try to bring some work in and teach them some work skills. So that's when we really started to see what we call the school to sheltered workshop pipeline. Kids that were with disabilities who were exiting high school did not go to vocational rehabilitation. They did not get $200 worth of VR services, and they did not get an opportunity to go to work. They were offered to go and visit the sheltered workshop, and the expectation was as soon as you graduate, you will go to the sheltered workshop, and that is going to constitute your future career, okay? Now, again, if you talk to sheltered workshops, they claim that they are therapeutic, rehabilitative programs designed to help people learn and prepare for the job skills so that individuals could learn and prepare for competitive employment. The reality is sheltered workshops lead nowhere. People will spend the rest of their life usually in the sheltered workshops, and they would, certainly be paid absolute minimum amount of money doing work for other businesses for whom those businesses can be making thousands and sometimes millions of dollars on the backs of people with disabilities. So we didn't exactly solve the problem with IDEA and transition, because the school to sheltered workshop pipeline was very evident and existed. So sheltered workshops go by a bunch of names, and sometimes they're really fancy names, but basically they're congregate facilities. And they were intended, at least on paper, to help people prepare both the work skills and the social skills for the competitive labor market. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, we know, and I know because I've worked there, that segregation is damaging. In true confessions, when I was doing job placement, I was doing it for a sheltered workshop, okay? And I would see, we employed 300 people in a sheltered workshop. And I would see how the segregation, people kind of became institutionalized. If you've ever seen Shawshank Redemption, it's kind of the same thing. Prisoners who are isolated get very reliant on that isolation and that routine, and they're not really learning or doing other things. And I'm not associating disability with Shawshank Redemption at all. It's just that's one of my favorite movies, and I watched it the other night. And I remember the scene there where he's talking about, we're institutionalized. So anyway, isolation hinders development, socialization skills, self-esteem, and work skills. More importantly than that, it denies people the ability to choose the type of work they do. Sheltered workshops bring in work from local businesses, and they do whatever the work is they have available. Not everybody loves to do light assembly work. Not everybody likes to sort colored pegs. Not everybody likes to, has the dexterity or whatever to do the type of work that's required. So individuals aren't able to interview for a job or choose a job that they like. You have to do what is available. And when I worked in the sheltered workshop, and one of the reasons that I left was I was doing a really good job at getting people jobs in the community. And we ran a training program, a work adjustment and a skills training program, and I was supposed to place those people into the community. Well, it was a prosperous time in Delaware at the time when I was working. And so jobs were very, there were a lot of jobs because Governor DuPont was basically bringing every financial institution across the country into Delaware because of the lucrative tax laws. So we had a lot of banking businesses and businesses incorporating. So I had people in the workshop starting to come to me and say, Cheryl, I heard you got, so-and-so a job. Can you help me get a job? So I started helping people in the sheltered workshop to get jobs. And guess what? I got called into the principal's office and I was told, leave our employees alone because we need them to complete our contract requirements. You go work with the work adjustment trainee who was in a 10-week work adjustment training period, which meant they would have been in our facility for 50 days, and yet they missed 25 days of work. You go and help them get a job with the business. So then it's like something is not wrong, not right here. So, but going back to generally segregated settings, individuals are placed in jobs that require skills they will never master. If you don't like something, you're not necessarily in a big rush to do it. And so you avoid it. You spend a lot of time at the water cooler, or you take longer lunches, or you go to the bathroom a lot. And then guess what happens? Your behavior is interpreted as non-compliance. And then you're basically, well, you're clearly not job ready because you're not doing what you need to do. And so sheltered workshops lead nowhere. Okay, next slide. All right, so segregation again reinforces a life of poverty because they are allowed to pay sub-minimum wages under Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standard Act. Now, if I was to refuse to pay Nancy Anderson sub-minimum wage because she had red hair or because I didn't like her, I would be violating the law. But Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act allows individuals with disabilities to be paid less than the minimum wage simply because they are a person with a disability. And for years, the belief was If you were a person with a disability, then clearly your capability to do certain works was restricted, and therefore it was okay to pay you sub-minimum wage. Whereas again, the real intent of the law, this was passed in 1938, and it was to give wounded veterans the dignity of continuing employment at a time when we were a manufacturing economy. Okay, and the veterans from World War I came back with very physical disabilities that were often very limited in a time when we were a manufacturing economy. We are no longer a manufacturing economy, okay? And I would defy anybody to tell me what your productivity is on a certain day. If you have ever gone to work with a toothache, I will pretty much guarantee that your productivity that day is greatly diminished because there's nothing worse than toothache pain. I will guarantee that women who are pregnant and in their later stages of pregnancy, I have seen this in our office, women in their 8th and 9th month of pregnancy are struggling. And I can remember walking in and seeing one of our staff members fast asleep at her desk in her 9th month of pregnancy, simply because of the pregnancy. Her productivity that day was sucky, but nobody said, okay, we're going to dock your pay today because you're not producing at 100%. So I don't know how we can really justify an outmoded discriminatory program or policy such as 14C. So the 14C allows for a lot of exploitation, as we saw from Henry's Turkey Farm. It also conflicts with a lot of other public policy laws, such as freedom to choose, maximum economic self-sufficiency. And most importantly, I think that with Section 14C and sub-minimum wage, it perpetuates a myth that your productivity is directly related to whether or not you have a disability and how much you can produce. And again, there are study after study after study that show that there's this fallacy around productivity. I could do something, if I'm asked to put together widgets, whatever a widget is, and I put together 10 widgets, of which the quality is only good on 5 of them, then my productivity can be high, but my quality is poor. And yet I'm only being paid based on quality. So there's a lot of different factors that go into what constitutes a good employee, et cetera, and productivity is not necessarily one of them. Next slide, and there's a note that Nancy put in. Alabama has 4 sheltered workshops that are currently certified by the Department of Labor, employing 130 individuals. And yes, now I will say that we have seen over the last 4 years a very significant decrease in the number of 14C certificate holders. Many provider agencies have decided that it's just too complicated, it's too much work, it's too cumbersome, and we want to do away with sub-minimum wage, and so they're not even using their 14C certificate. That's the good news. The bad news, and I'm just kind of saying this as a general, as a cautionary point, to simply end sub-minimum wage and to now say, okay, we're going to pay everybody minimum wage is a step in the right direction. But if the work that they're doing should really have a prevailing wage of, say, $10 or $11 an hour, and we're simply paying minimum wage, which I think on a national level is still $7.25 an hour, are we really complying with the intent and the purpose of labor laws? But that's the latest issue that I'm working on with the Department of Labor, and they are extremely concerned about that. So segregation is out. There's this integration mandate in both the ADA, and within vocational rehabilitation that says services should be provided in the most in the least restrictive environment in the ADA and the most integrated environment possible within vocational rehabilitation. And the law of the land is now competitive integrated employment. Let's go to the next slide. And there's a question in the box that I will get to in a minute. So competitive integrated employment, next slide, please, is currently defined in law, okay? And it is defined in law as the job is competitive, which means that the individual must be paid the same wages as other individuals without disabilities doing the same work. And it must be integrated, which means that people with disabilities interact with non-disabled individuals the same as everybody else. So it's employment that's paid a competitive wage and in an environment that is integrated and not segregated. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You have to tell me whether this is fact or fiction. Oh, Jennifer, let me answer your question. Why hasn't the policy been challenged by national disability rights groups? It has for years. As long as I've been in Washington, we have been talking, or I have been talking about, we need to end subminimum wage. But the subminimum wage provision that allows people to be paid that is part of a larger piece of legislation called the Fair Labor Standard Act. The Fair Labor Standard Act sets the federal minimum wage. It sets the standard for when overtime must be paid. It requires equal pay for equal wages, particularly between the sexes, and it also limits child labor, okay? Hundreds and thousands of businesses across the United States have to comply with the standard work week, the overtime pay, you know, all of these other things. If we try to open up the Fair Labor Standard Act and specifically say, we want you to eliminate the subminimum wage provision, then there's nothing from stopping the local restaurant association from saying, we want to make this change, or industry saying, well, we want to make the standard work week 50 hours a week. So when you're designing and advocating for legislation, you have to also consider the unintended consequences that could happen. And policy change really does have to be made in collaboration and with some consensus. So that's why we haven't solved it yet. Although there are now 12 states that have legislation, state legislation that ends the use of subminimum wage. Now, normally federal law would supersede state law unless the state law affords greater protection than the federal law. So we have 12 states that have done something, and we're working on that. Okay. All right. So fact or fiction, we're going to go through these quickly. People who work will lose critical supports and benefits. Anybody have a thought whether it's fact or fiction? Well, we've already really talked about that. It's really fiction, but people think it's fact. There's a lot of confusion. Okay. Next one, rehabilitation in segregated settings are safer. How many people think that's true?
Fiction.
Fiction. It absolutely is fiction, but you would be surprised how many people believe that individuals are safer in a segregated setting because they don't have to compete with other people. They're going to be taken care of, okay? And that the settings are safer in terms of the work that is being done. It absolutely is fiction. One of the things that I have done over the last, 10, 12 years is I've worked with states to do sheltered workshop monitoring in their states. And I have been to one state twice, and I have been to one particular sheltered workshop twice, because that sheltered workshop has had 2 deaths in the last 10 years. Okay. Now 2 may not sound like a lot, but 2 deaths is too many for a sheltered workshop that employs people with disabilities. Okay. The next one, people aren't job ready. Helping professionals for years, I have heard them say you are not job ready, especially if you're spending too much time in the bathroom avoiding that task that you don't like to do. Okay. I would probably, if I was evaluated based on my ability to write reports, I would be told I'm not job ready because I hate writing reports, and I do it the night before the absolute deadline. Okay. But people are constantly told because of their behavior or their attitude, or that they may have transportation problems, that they're not job ready. I don't know what job ready means. My parents never told me I was ready for a job. My parents simply told me that you want a car, you buy insurance, you pay for gasoline. Okay. Productivity is lower for people with disabilities. Okay. Again, I think we all know that that's fiction. Okay. Because people with disabilities, if they are matched to the right job with the right job supports, are just as capable of doing that job as anybody else. This next one, their limited work choices, lack of assistive technology, and reasonable accommodation affect productivity. Is that fact or fiction? I'm not seeing any answers, but again, that is absolutely true. If people are not given good job choices and they are not provided necessary assistive technology and they are not provided reasonable accommodation, it is going to affect productivity. Okay. Especially when there's so many ways. Assistive technology is absolutely, it's a benefit enhancer. It's a work enhancement and reasonable accommodation. If you can't reach what you need to work on and your desk needs to be higher, or you need a headset rather than to pick up and answer a telephone because of your dexterity with your hand, those things will affect your ability to do the job. And the last one is employers will be stuck because they can't fire a person with a disability. Okay. I know I said this yesterday, that I've had employers tell me I can't hire somebody because I will be stuck with them for eternity. And employers don't understand that when we're talking about employment of people with disabilities, we're talking about otherwise eligible or otherwise qualified individual. We are not asking you to hire somebody out of the goodness of your heart. We are asking you to give a person with a disability who's otherwise qualified the same opportunity for employment. Next slide. Next slide. Can we move? Because I can't remember. This is where I should have printed out a copy. All right. Anybody have any comments while we wait for the slide to move forward?
I think you brought up a really good point, and this is Jess here, about productivity standards. Just from personal experience of mine, as we just have such a big American culture on productivity that really drives down quality of everything. But then employers want to hold us to the productivity standards of able people, and one puts in two categories of able versus disabled, and sometimes they want to shift productivity standards, but because we wouldn't meet productivity based on our disability, we're not qualified for the job. So
let me tell you the story about Walgreens. Everybody knows what Walgreens is, right? Huge national chain. So Walgreens, again, I don't remember how many years ago. I've been doing this so long, everything blends. But anyway, Walgreens was going to open a new distribution center in Anderson, South Carolina, maybe North Carolina. I hate North and South and East and West states because I'm geographically impaired. Otherwise, I'd have gone back to Washington State rather than Washington, D.C. But anyway, so they were going to open this large distribution center. Randy Lewis, who was in charge of developing and opening this facility, went to the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency as they were preparing the development of it. And he said, we're going to open this distribution center. We're going to hire like 400 people, and we'd like to hire as many people with disabilities as we possibly can. And Randy Lewis had a son with autism, so he was familiar with the challenges around employment. And the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency, and Randy further said, these are going to be full-time positions. Individuals are going to be paid the same as their non-disabled peers doing the same jobs, which is exactly what we want to have happen. And there are going to be times when overtime is going to be expected. And the job is going to have full benefits. They will have paid vacations, holidays, sick leave, medical care, etc. And so you would think that the VR agency would jump up and down and say, yay, we have an employer we don't even have to sell to that wants to hire our people with disabilities. And instead, the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency representative that I was talking to said, oh, I don't think we're going to be able to help you because our people are not going to be able to work full time. And our people are not going to be able, certainly not going to be able to work overtime. And many of them are going to have transportation problems. So I don't think we're going to be able to help you. Okay. When I heard that, somebody peeled me off the ceiling. But in the end, they did open the facility, and roughly 45% of the people that they hired were in fact people with disabilities. Now, Anderson, South Carolina is a fairly rural area. Like many other parts of the country, there is not a well-established system of public transportation. So individuals were kind of left to their own to determine how they were going to get to work. All right, so they open the facility, they hire people. The industrial engineers who were setting it up, because many of the people that they hired couldn't read. So we can't put labels up there because these people with disabilities aren't going to be able to read the labels. So how are they going to know where they're going to go? And so they decided to label things according to different animals. Okay, this would be the elephant section, this would be the leopard section, this would be the cat section, not, you know. And so then the industrial engineers were concerned about, well, what order do we put the animals in? Do we have to put the animals in alphabetical order? I mean, they spent all this time like fighting stupid stuff. So anyway, they open, people are working. About 6 or 7 weeks into the thing, there is an accident where a forklift runs into the shelving unit. And there was a person with a disability and there was a person without a disability that were involved in moving the forklift and the products through. And of course, the people in the front office says, oh my God, we knew it was going to happen. We knew that our accident rate was going to increase because we're hiring people with disabilities. Okay, again, assumptions. So everything's recorded there, everything's on tape. When they looked at the tape to find out what had caused this accident, so to speak, they found that, and I don't remember whether the forklift driver was a person with a disability and the person guiding it was not. I don't remember the order, but what they found when they reviewed the tape was that a pretty girl had walked by. And as the pretty girl walked by, both heads turned, okay? And hence went into the whatever. So, you know, the thing there was, it had nothing to do with hiring people with disabilities. It had to do with the fact that boys will be boys. Let's just put it that way. Boys will be boys. Okay. So, and it was very, very annoying that vocational rehabilitation took the approach. They're supposed to be helping people maximize employment, that their approach to it was, we're not going to be able to help you because our people won't be able to do it. People who didn't have transportation to work were often walking to work. Their coworkers with or without disabilities who drove would see that people walking, they'd stop and pick them up. All the issues that vocational rehab was afraid would be barriers to employment were worked out by the people who were working there. Heck, you live in my neighborhood, I'll be happy to pick you up and take you home. You know, those kinds of things. They don't give people with disabilities credit for solving problems they've been solving all their life. All right. So I'm going to go back to this. We have this quandary with work. We have a lot of myths, fears, and misconceptions. We've talked about them. I'm not going to go, you know, really into them anymore. We have a huge problem with stereotyping. Okay. And I hear it a lot now, but I didn't necessarily hear it for a while. Now, the big thing with individuals who are in the autism spectrum is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But for the longest time, it's people with disabilities can't. People with disabilities won't. People with disabilities, whatever. So there's a lot of stereotyping and concerns out there. There's also a lot of competing interests. Let's be honest about that. Sheltered workshops not only include buildings, bricks and mortar, but they have employees beyond people with disabilities. The staff who work there have jobs, okay? Those people want to continue their jobs. Yet, if you eliminate segregated employment and those people are now working out in the community, where are those jobs going to go? What's going to happen to the building itself? You know, we have a mortgage on this building. How are we going to pay our mortgage if we're not doing contract work? Plus, placing people individually into jobs is a lot more expensive and time consuming than warehousing people and having a few supervisors. So there's a lot of competing interests around changing the model and moving people out into the community. There's also that concept of best interest versus expressed interest. Well, if we take people out into the community, what if they fail? What if they're not able to continue to work? What if they don't like what they're doing? What if they quit their job? And so there's a lot of concern about it's in the best interest to protect people's benefits. So let's just leave them here. Now, P&As operate on what we call expressed interest. We don't care what's in their best interest. We care about removing the barriers to whatever their expressed interest is. And if they want to try a job in the community, we should allow that. We should not be telling people, no, it's much better for you if you stay here because you'll have transportation. The van will bring you here in the morning. You know, whatever. It's just going to be much easier for you if you stay in a segregated setting. And I've already talked about the dignity of risk. We need to allow people with disabilities to make choices and to take risks rather than always protecting their safety net or protecting the individuals from failing. How many of you have ever attempted something and failed? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. You're all still alive. You're all getting up in the morning and going on to things. So people learn from failures. You know, failure just means first attempt at learning. Okay, so we need to allow people that same dignity of risk. Next slide, please. All right, so current employment programs. I think I'm coming to the end and we'll have a few minutes for discussion. We have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I always refer to that when I'm talking about employment of people with disabilities. I believe that should be the first go-to. Under law, there is a presumption now of what we call the presumption of benefit for vocational rehabilitation services. If an individual has a physical or mental impairment that results in a substantial impediment to employment, they are presumed to be eligible for vocational rehabilitation services, and they are presumed to be able to benefit from those services. And again, people with the most significant disabilities should be provided services first. So then we have IDEA comes along and supports that because in 1990, transition requirements were added to IDEA, and the transition requirements are basically that the individual should be referred to vocational rehabilitation in a timely fashion so that there is a plan in place, a transition plan in place before the individual exits high school. Now, for the longest time, VR would say they only provide services to individuals in their terminal year of high school. And that is too late, okay? We don't ask graduating seniors in high school. We don't wait till May or June of their graduating year to say to them, okay, what are you going to do next? And maybe it's time for you to apply for college. We do that starting years ahead. Same thing needs to happen with transition. So what happened in 2014 with the Workforce Investment Act, or when the Workforce Investment Act, I'm sorry, became Title IV of the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act, was that Congress said, we've got to break this cycle of poverty. We've got to break this cycle of students receiving special education services and basically going home. So now, under the Workforce Investment Act, or I'm sorry, under the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act, they're basically the same legislation, but when it was reauthorized, it was given a new name. VR is now required to spend 15% of their money on what we call pre-employment transition services. So youth starting as early as age 14 can start to receive pre-employment transition services. Now, what does that mean? Those are things, those are services and supports to help an individual understand what their post-secondary education opportunities might be, like college, what kinds of careers they can explore. It requires that students receive work-based learning experience, that they actually get paid work experience in real job settings prior to exiting high school, that they have career interests and inventories done, that they basically, we start talking to individuals with disabilities to talk about what their options are much earlier than their terminal year of high school. They can also apply for and receive VR services at that time. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, but VR can provide vocational supports that perhaps the school systems won't. And again, we have the Ticket to Work and Work Incentive Improvement Act. A lot of people with disabilities don't require vocational rehabilitation. If I was to lose my job tomorrow, I don't need VR services. I just need another job. So a lot of the employment networks, their specialty is helping people obtain employment, or preparing to obtain employment by, resume writing, interview skills, how to conduct a job search. If I had to conduct a job search right now, I would be probably totally screwed, so to speak, because I wouldn't know how to get a job using an online service. So employment networks and the Ticket to Work program can help with things like that. So these are programs that are readily available, and there's no reason you can't mix and match them. You could go to the local employment network at the American Job Center, and you could be working with them as well as working on vocational rehabilitation, getting a certification program in something. So these are services currently available to people with disabilities, but people may not know they're there. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's my kind of bottom line. In times of state, but with, everybody's fighting for the same crumbs for services and supports. But when we work together, and community partnerships are really critical to help promote work and work opportunities. That's one of the things that I really liked in Vertical Harvest, is the fact that they brought in outside services and supports who are all working for the common good, and that is to keep everybody working, because when everybody works, everybody wins. Okay, it increases the tax base and the revenue. It gives people a sense of purpose. It helps people recover from disabilities, does all kinds of things. So employment of people with disabilities is really important. Next slide. This is me. People want to contact me, good or bad. You feel free to contact me. This is my work email address and our office phone number. If you call my organization, what isn't on here is I am an extension 117. And if you call the office, I'm not there, it will go to voicemail, and the voicemail converts into email, which then comes to my telephone. So that's the end of my presentation. We can close the PowerPoint and we'll open it up for questions or discussion. And this took a whole lot longer than I thought it was going to, and I apologize. So any comments or questions? I'm also going to scan the chat box. Go ahead. Not Niles? That's
It's actually Audra Broughton. We're doing this together at Davis.
okay.
He's a graduate of this high school. And in Mobile County, we have a major teaching shortage. And our transition department thing, we don't have, I mean, we need all these things here. If you know anybody that needs a job, Niles is actually, his ideas we're going to present to, you know, I mean, I guess the superintendent, because our kids are they're not prepared to go to work. They go to feed the Gulf and they go, I don't know. I mean, but we don't have teachers. We have like an aide doing this. So I was trying to, one of my kids came, is so sad. In the 11th grade, he said his dream was to be a welder. So he got put on the list to go to the Bryant Center, which is where they train the students. And because they got to the special education students last, he did not get to go. So we're trying to reach out to Austell to see if we can get a job shadowing program and something like that. But Niles needs to say some stuff. But if you guys, we have we have 3 sped positions open right now. So we have each like 40-something kids on our caseload. And it's like, I can't even get to the stuff with the PIPA thing because I've been sick and it's just crazy, but I can't leave the kids. And he's a reason. This is a product of what my unit did here at Davidson, but I like to thank you so much. He can't see it's like everything is going wrong. On his computer, he can't see the PowerPoints, and on my computer, I couldn't get my technology to work. But thank you so much, and we enjoyed this so much.
Oh yeah, to build on what Audra just said there, I've seen so much just go absolutely wrong in the time that I've been out of high school. I have just seen, budget cuts. She can tell you more about the budget cuts here, but they cut her unit. It's not just her, but the ILC in Mobile, we are really just doubling down on trying to get things sped back up here. Things started back up here. There are things that were around in my time that are no longer around now.
Right.
And
I understand exactly what you're telling me. I am not someone who can help you in Alabama, but I think that feel free to reach me offline or feel free to talk with somebody at ADAP who may be able to help you with specific issues. They're not going to be able to generally help you and find a job or whatever, but if there are specific things that are breaking down, it would help them to know what those are if they don't already know, because they can also address things on the larger level. Okay.
Thank you.
So, but feel free to reach out to me. And my contact information is there.
You're fine. Totally leave it up.
can you leave the slides up? Because Audra's trying to take pictures of them, trying to download them and everything that we need to do for them. I can't see what's going on with the slides on this computer, but she can see it on hers. And
all right, well, yeah, that sounds like a technology issue there, but
exactly.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but if otherwise you can reach out to me and I can send them to you. That's not a problem. Okay.
Hey,
We'll make sure you get them. Just contact me.
Available for you.
Say that again, please.
Yes. All the slides are already uploaded into, today's are not uploaded into Canvas yet, but they will be. As soon as I get home, I'll get it all uploaded and everything will be there available. The segregated and exploited handbook is already there, and yesterday's slides are there, just not today's.
Okay, and also too, I don't know if Audra has explained this to you, but the reason that's kind of we're trying to handle the situation down here in especially in Mobile, and she told you all the situations that we're going through. That's why she's been kind of backed up lately. So yeah, we're keeping up as best we can. It's just we're seeing now that it's a lot more than what we thought it was going to be.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions, comments?
I have this is Angela Richardson. I have a comment. I think it was awesome where you put in there about dignified risk, because even I just took a job And even in talking with management, that risk applies to every employee, not just those with a disability.
Absolutely.
Any new hire is a leap of faith. You don't know what you're getting when you hire anybody. And so that's really huge. And I really appreciate that point.
Well, thank you. I think it's really important that we stop looking at people with disabilities as this, special, unique population who's so different from every other person. And one of the reasons that yesterday somebody made the comment about people with disabilities, and I know that I wrote down, not all disabilities are visible. And there's a lot of people with hidden disabilities who clearly are going to be less subjective to blatant discrimination based on stigma, but who sometimes and often struggle with, the same issues. I mean, we need to start looking at individuals as individuals, and consider everybody on an individual basis, not just categorizing. I think there's nothing worse than labeling. And I'm going to say something here that may kind of annoy people, but I think sometimes people with disabilities don't want to be labeled as a person with a disability, because as soon as you get that label, it's going to be a lifelong label and you're never going to be able to shake it. So anyway, I don't want to go off on a tantrum, but I could. I have lots of tantrums I could go off on. I could stand on a soapbox for days and not run out of things to say. Other questions or comments? Well, I want to appreciate the fact that you have put up with me and listened to me talk for many, many hours. I'm really glad I'm not on your side having to listen to me talk, because I can do it. I would encourage you, when you have questions or problems or facing issues with, discrimination and employment of people with disabilities, either individually, or if you know of people, that you refer them to ADAP, particularly issues with vocational rehabilitation. When VR says no, that means that you get somebody else to take a second look at it, because VR has the money. They get lots and lots of money, and yet they are not providing proper services, or they're restricting money when they don't need to. And the CAP program is going to be an effective advocacy program now in Alabama, and we need to hold VR's toes to the fire. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the PIPA folks. I love these nicknames. And I'm going to forewarn Nancy Anderson that I'm going to be in touch with her in the next week or two, because I do partners training in a lot of states. And this one, I am impressed with the way Alabama has things set up and the way Alabama's looking at. So I want to talk about that and continue to work on this issue. So thank you all. And Nancy, thank you for inviting me. And I hope that for Nancy's sake, I haven't disappointed. I'm always afraid I'm going to disappoint somebody who invites me to speak. So, and any feedback or ideas you have for what I can do better, I'm wide open for that too. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your partners training. And hopefully, if any of you ever make it to DC for anything, especially for lobbying or testifying before Congress or meeting with folks on the Hill, let me know that you're coming, and I would love to meet up with you. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you so much. I know several of us will take you up on that offer.
Good.
I think we could all give you a virtual standing ovation. Thank you so much for the information that you've given us. It was just outstanding, amazing. And then, like I said, everything will be uploaded into Canvas so you can refer back to it. They're making me move in front of the camera now.
I don't
know where the camera is. I can't see myself.
Oh, there it is. I see microphone.
I'm too tall. Okay. Anyway, so we have a break. We'll be back about 12:15 with Mr. Lorenzo Brown from the Is Able Center, also Gwendolyn Brown and Eric Brown, who is a previous PIPA graduate. So you have about until 12:15 to get a drink, stretch your legs. Thank you again so much for your presentation, Cheryl.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Meant so much.